Okay, so hello and welcome to this webinar. Good afternoon. I would just like to introduce myself before we get started. So I'm Sajedeh.Lashani. I'm one of the product managers here at bioMérieux, and I look after the ETEST range. I'm joined by Jürgen, and I'll let Jürgen, you introduce yourself as well.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I'm Jürgen van Dam, and I'm responsible for the marketing department for Benelux and Nordics. And I'll let the floor to Saj.
Perfect, thank you. So just before we get started, a reminder that you are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, so please do use the Q&A box. We've also had some questions submitted before the event, so we'll address those at the end of the presentation too. If there's anything that we don't get round to because of time constraints, we'll follow those up after the webinar, but please do use the Q&A box and submit your questions. You'll have seen that everybody is muted on arrival, so there won't be any background noise during the presentation. And without further ado, I think we'll just get stuck into the presentation. Okay, so thank you for joining this webinar on reading an ETEST. What we'll cover today includes a quick introduction into what an ETEST is, how to apply the ETEST, reading the ETEST, and we'll also go through some frequently asked questions. There will of course be opportunities to ask questions, so please feel free to type your questions during the presentation and we'll address them at the end. So let's get started with what an ETEST is. It's worth just touching on the MIC value and its significance. So MIC stands for minimum inhibitory concentration. And this value represents the minimum concentration of an antimicrobial needed to inhibit growth. And this value helps assign interpreted categories, so S, I, and R, which are defined by ETEST. An MIC value can help orient the choice of drug, detect low-level resistance, and ETEST strips are essentially an easy way to determine the MIC value. So in a nutshell, ETESTs are a ready-to-use susceptibility testing strip, and they're available for antibiotic, antifungal susceptibility testing, as well as antibiotic resistance detection. And if we take a look at the composition of the ETEST, the upper surface of the strip shows the MIC scale, which illustrates up to 15 two-fold dilution increments. The lower surface carries the actual antibiotic gradient. And at the top of the strip, you'll also find a 2- or 3-letter code which identifies the actual antibiotic. So we'll move on to actually applying the ETEST. So to begin with, when you're determining what media you should be using, your first point of reference should be the instructions for use. So you can find those on the resource center. There you'll find a table which details what media is recommended for that particular ETEST. The brand you choose should have good batch-to-batch reproducibility and information from the manufacturers. Take note of the expiry dates, the manufacturing dates, and this will just help ensure that you're getting accurate and reliable MIC values. We do have some pointers here to help verify agar plate quality. So the surface and depth of the agar should be uniform. The actual depth should be roughly 4 millimeters, give or take 0.5 millimeter. Okay, so next, we want to look at inoculum preparation, and to prepare the inoculum, you want to emulsify well-isolated colonies from an overnight agar plate. The suspension prepared in broth should be used within 15 minutes, and it's important to ensure that the inoculum suspension has the correct number of colony-forming units to match the appropriate McFarland standard. So this is especially important for fastidious and mucoid organisms. If the inoculum is correct, what you'll get is a confluent or almost confluent lawn of growth that'll be obtained after incubation. So you can find guidance for the concentration and suspension types in the IFU. So again, the instructions for use on the resource center. And I have an example of how this is presented in a table in the instructions for use a few slides down. Just to stress the importance of concentration in obtaining good results, we can see in this image that a concentration which is too weak can result in an ellipse that isn't fully formed. And if the concentration is too strong, you won't get the crisp definition that you need to accurately read the ETEST. So both of these situations can make reading the MIC value difficult. So here is the table that I mentioned earlier. You'll find details on the media, suspension, concentration, and also the incubation conditions which are required. I'd like to take a minute just to highlight the single IFU, which combines the technical information which was formerly available in different documents. So most ETEST will now have a single IFU, and you can search for these on the Resource Centre using your product reference. For any ETESTs that don't have a single IFU yet, the various documentation is of course still available, but these single IFUs should make it easier and more efficient to find all the information you need in one place. So let's move on to inoculation. So here you want to dip a sterile, non-toxic and not too tightly spun swab into the inoculum suspension. Remove excess fluid by just pressing that swab against the inside wall of the test tube. Remove more fluid if you're streaking a 90mm plate and less if it's a 150. And we'll move on to swabbing the actual plate. So next, you want to swab the entire agar surface 3 times, rotating the plate approximately 60 degrees each time. And that will ensure even distribution of inoculum. Just a quick note for antifungal susceptibility testing, you'll need to repeat that streaking procedure a second time with the same inoculum. I've also got an image here of the retro C80 inoculator, which is an alternative method. So if you are a retro user, please refer to the user manual for detailed instructions, but in either case, allow excess moisture, to be absorbed for about 15 to 20 minutes so that the surface of the agar is completely dry before applying the ETEST strip. Moving on to application and incubation. A key point here is first allowing the ETEST to reach room temperature when it's removed from the fridge or freezer. When handling the ETEST, you want to avoid touching the surface of the strip that contains the gradient, so the side opposite the MIC scale. To pick up the ETEST, we'd recommend using a manual applicator, for example, the Mini Grip It, which you can see in the image over here. The NEMA C88 vacuum pen can also be used. Forceps or a similar tool can also be used. So you want to use forceps, for example, and all of these tools actually, to grip the top of the strip, the section that contains the 2 or 3 letter code. Here's a quick example of how to open the single packs. So what you want to do essentially is hold the blister between your thumb and index finger, press forward with the back of the index finger to break open the aluminium film, bend the top part back to open the packaging completely, and again take the ETEST strip by holding the end, and that's the end that has the letter E and the 2 or 3 letter code. So your agar is now dry and ready for the ETEST strip. Ensure that the whole strip is in complete contact with the agar surface, and if there are any air pockets that you can see under the strip, you can remove them by pressing gently on the strip with the applicator tip or the forceps that you were using, making sure that you're not moving the strip and working from the lowest concentration upwards. An important note here is that once you've actually applied the strip, you can't move it, and the reason for that is because the antibiotic immediately begins to release into the agar and you'll get a deformed ellipse and your MIC value might not be accurate. Depending on your plate size, we have a few different ETEST configuration options for reference, which can be seen in this image. Once you've applied the ETEST to the plates, incubate the agar plates in an inverted position, so with the lid down in stacks no higher than 5. Right, so now we'll move on to reading an ETEST. So when it comes to reading an ETEST, the first question is, do you see a sharp endpoint? If the answer is yes, you read the MIC where the growth intersects the strip. If that's between markings, then you want to read the upper MIC value. If the answer is no, you first want to check if the ETEST is bactericidal, bacteriostatic, and that information can be found on the ETEST reading guide. So let's say it's bactericidal. you would read at 100% inhibition. And if it's bacteriostatic, you'd read at so-called 80% inhibition, ignoring trailing and microcolonies. So to help understand this a little bit better, it's worth going through some examples. So in this example, do you have a sharp endpoint? And yes, indeed you do. So you'd read the MIC where growth intersects the strip. And in that case, you would have 1.5 as your MIC in this situation. This is a similar example, but where the intersection is between markings, you want to read the upper MIC value, which in this case is 0.094. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we have a hazy endpoint here, and the next question is whether the mode of action is bactericidal or bacteriostatic. So again, this information will be available, is available on the ETEST reading guides. This situation happens to be bacteriostatic. So if we remind ourselves of the rule, what we need to do is read at the first significant sign of growth inhibition, so ignoring the trailing and the microcolonies. And in this situation, that would mean that the MIC is 0.032. Now we've got a bactericidal example. And again, for this one, just a reminder of the rule is we want to read at 100% inhibition. So if you take a look on the right side of the strip, there is still growth at 0.064. So the MIC in this situation would be 0.094. Just to make things a little bit more tricky, there are some exceptions. So when you have microcolonies within an ellipse, you want to count those that are within 1 to 3 millimeters of the strip. So in both of these examples, so both the bactericidal, bacteriostatic example, the MIC is reported as the highest concentration on the strip. Now, if you have a distorted ellipse, this may be an indication that the agar was too wet when applying the strip. And again, this is why we stressed a little bit earlier when we were talking about applying the ETEST. You want to wait until the agar is completely dry. What you'd have to do in this situation is essentially repeat the test and just make sure that the agar is completely dry before applying the strip. Some more exceptions. So where there's no ellipse, the amount of antimicrobial on the strip is not enough to inhibit growth. And alternatively, if you look on the right-hand side, if the ellipse intersects below the strip, the lowest antimicrobial amount is enough to inhibit growth. I also want to touch on the ARD strips, which are slightly different. So in the case of ARD strips, you're essentially getting a positive or negative result as opposed to an MIC. So on either side of the strip, you have a code, and the side with the extra letter indicates the side with the inhibitor. So over here on the left-hand side, that's the side with the inhibitor. And I know this is quite a bit of information to digest on a screen, but essentially an ARD test for ESBL, for example, is positive if one of the following is true. So the ratio of the MIC without inhibitor over the MIC with inhibitor is greater than or equal to 8. The difference between two MICs is greater than or equal to 3 two-fold dilutions. There's a deformed ellipse or there is a phantom zone. And if the ARD test result is negative, then one of the following is true. So the ratio of the MIC without inhibitor is less than 8, and the difference between the two MICs is less than 3 two-fold dilutions, so the opposite of a positive test. If it's not determinable, one of the following will be true. So the MICs are found to be greater than the highest value on all strip ends. One strip tests negative and the other is not determinable. So as I said, this is quite a bit of information and it's worth breaking it down slightly by looking at some examples. So In this example, you've got a deformed ellipse, and then you've got another example with a phantom zone. And as we said on the previous slide, this would essentially confirm that the test is positive. When there's no phantom zone or no deformed ellipse, you're able to calculate a positive result. And here's an example of how that can be done. The MIC without the inhibitor is 8, and the MIC with the inhibitor is 0.38. So if we divide as highlighted on the rules on the previous slide, an answer greater than or equal to 8 is considered positive, which is true in this case. An alternative way of calculating is finding out whether the difference in dilutions is greater than or equal to 3. So the difference between 0.38 and 8 is greater than 3, and therefore, again, the test is positive. So these are essentially two ways that you can calculate the positive result, assuming that you can't see a deformed ellipse or a phantom zone. So let's summarize what we've gone through already. The basic rule for ETEST strips is to read the MIC where the ellipse intersects the strip, rounding up to the nearest value where necessary. The method for reading hazy endpoints depends on whether the antibiotic is bactericidal or bacteriostatic. Certain exceptional cases must be recognized and dealt with accordingly, and if ever in doubt, you can contact bioMérieux for support. The MIC may be used for categorization using the breakpoints from the most recent guidelines. An ARD test is positive if the ratio of the MIC without inhibitor over the MIC with inhibitor is greater than or equal to 8, or of course if there is a deformed ellipse or a phantom zone, and we have all of this information. I know it was quite a bit of information on the ARD, which you can have a look at after this presentation. And again, any questions, you can reach out to us. So now I'd like to move on to some frequently asked questions, and these may address some questions that you also have. These are questions that we've had come in a few times, so I thought it was worth addressing them during this webinar. So one question we get is, can I use an ETEST that's fallen out of the packaging? So as long as the surface on which the ETEST strip has fallen is completely dry, it should be okay. The risk of contamination is very low, and very few species can grow on strips. But if in doubt, use a new strip. If you're using any of the old packaging and you have quite a few of the strips fallen out, you can QC one of the strips as an alternative. What if the strip is placed upside down on an agar? So we've had this before, and when we looked at the ETEST strip composition, the bottom of the strip is where the antibiotic is. So you want to pick up that strip and put it on the agar the right side up, and that's the side with the antibiotic. Essentially, if you put the side with the scale on the agar, you're not going to get an MIC value at all. So what if the strip is placed on an incorrect spot on the agar? So this is really important. So you want to leave the agar where it is if it's not going to be too problematic. Otherwise, you'll have to redo the ETEST, and that is because as soon as you place that strip on the agar, the antimicrobial will start to seep through. If in doubt, of course, you can always contact us. And I think finally, I want to also address this question, which is, where can I find ... And there are always a few questions about different resources. So I think the next slide is to go through where you can find some of those, what's available to support you. So the ETEST landing page is a new web page dedicated to the ETEST range. Here you'll find a complete product list, updates on new launches and discontinuations, information on webinars such as this one, and we'll be updating the page regularly. I'd also recommend favoriting this page as an online point of reference for all ETEST users. You'll have a few links there, and we'll be adding information, new updates, as and when they're released. The Resource Center is where you can find the single IFU that we mentioned during the webinar, and the other additional resources, as well as if your ETEST hasn't been switched to a single IFU, all of the supporting documents will still be available on the Resource Center. So I've also highlighted the reading guide as it contains information on the mode of action, which you'll need for bactericidal, bacteriostatic information. You should have received an email with the reading guide as well as a link to the ETEST landing page. So we do have an ETEST mailing list. If you haven't received this information, feel free to get in touch, let us know, and we can add you to that mailing list. And that is essentially a mailing list which is providing resources, updates, information, invitations to webinars such as this one. And any feedback that you have is very welcome, any suggestions and any content that you'd like to see. We welcome all of that feedback. Okay, so it's worth us having a quick look at the ETEST landing page just to show you what's already available as a resource, and we can give you a little bit of an insight into what would be available later on. So at the top of the ETEST landing page, you have some tabs that you can click on, and that will take you to that section of information, or alternatively, you can just scroll down the page and you'll find the same information. So to begin with, you'll see an ETEST overview, and you can click on this link over here, and that will give you a PDF version of the complete ETEST portfolio. So as we have new product launches or any discontinuations, that list will be updated. We also have a section on new products, so you can click on this drop down, and what you'll see is the product description, the product number, which is the reference that you'll use if you're searching for the single IFUs on the Resource Center, the size of the ETEST pack, and also the packaging type. So many of you will be aware that we have transitioned to using the single packs from the foam and the blister packs, for example. So you'll have information on what that packaging is. Again, new packaging updates, so you can see what old references have been transferred to the new ones and what the replacement reference number will be. So this will all make it a lot easier when you're searching for information on the Resource Center to have the most updated information and have a good idea of what the pack sizes are and what the packaging was and what it will be. So in this case, for example, we've got the S30, which is the new single packs, and the old packaging was the B30, which is the blister pack. So also webinars and resources. So as I mentioned, having information of what's coming up, what's available, any suggestions that you have, you can use this contact form at the bottom. You can leave a comment and say, we really enjoyed the webinar, we want another one, or we didn't enjoy the webinar, but any suggestions, what you want to see on the landing page, etc., you can pop that into the contact form. You also have access to additional resources here, like the ETEST brochure for a little bit more information. We have a link here to the Resource Center, so if you haven't yet logged in or you don't have an account, you can find that on the ETEST landing page. Click on that, create an account, and you'll have access to all of the documentation that you need. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining the webinar. I hope you found the information useful. And now we can move on to the Q&A. Okay, so we've had some questions, as I mentioned, which were submitted prior to the live session today. What we'll do is go through those questions. Jürgen, I'll let you go through some of those. One question just beforehand that we've had quite a few times is whether the session today is recorded, and it is indeed recorded and it will be shared. So if you have any colleagues that weren't able to attend today or want to catch up later, then that's absolutely fine, and we'll send the recording out. But I'll hand over to you, Jürgen.
Yep, thanks, Sash, for your clear presentation. We got some questions before the webinar. They are quite long, so I will try to condense them in a way that it will fit in one phrase. So the first question is about trimsulfa. So that is difficult to read with Cenotrophomonas. And they are asking how you need to read those combinations. And in that case, you'd always need to, as Saj explained, need to have a look, is your antibiotic bactericidal or bacteriostatic. So trimsulfa needs to be read if you have a hazy endpoint with the 80% rule. So it makes it a little bit trickier when you have a sharp edge, but with the hazy rule, so you need to read at the 80% border. And then the second question really fits into that, because people are asking like, and what is this 80%? So if you have, maybe Saj, if you can, if we can show an example, that's maybe easier to explain. If you can share your screen.
Yep, I can do that now.
So I mean, for a sharp endpoint, there's no discussion. Yeah. So here we have an example of a hazy point. So knowing that your antibiotic is bacteriostatic, then you need to read at this 80%. And 80%, you can also interpret that as saying like, okay, this is the first, I mean, the first line where you have a difference in growth. So you have these micro colonies that are coming up, and then you see next to that you have a denser growth at 0.032, and that is your 80%. So keep in mind, the first place where your growth changes and where it becomes denser, that's the 80% line. So I know 80% can be a little bit subjective, so take the first line where you see the denser growth, and you need to read the bacteriostatic antibiotics there. Keep in mind that even if you have a hazy endpoint and it's bactericidal, that you need to read at full inhibition. So that doesn't change. This is only the case with a bacteriostatic antibiotic. So that was another question that we got before, and it was linked to linezolid, and linezolid is a bacteriostatic antibiotic, so you need to read at 80% inhibition. Another question is on how to read beta-lactam antibiotics for Haemophilus species, but that's a little bit linked to all species. Again, you need to know if is my antibiotic bactericidal or bacteriostatic. Beta-lactams work on the cell wall of your bacteria. So what would happen? Your antibiotic will work on the cell wall. The bacteria cannot make the cell wall anymore, so they will explode. Because in the end, it will be a bactericidal effect, because you will really kill the bacteria. And when you have a bactericidal antibiotic, in that case, you really need to read at full inhibition. And then the fourth question that we got before is on the frequency of QC testing, because our IFU states that you need to do the QC testing according to each laboratory needs to choose that, and that's mentioned because every laboratory has the free will of changing their guidelines. So some are following Cumitech, some are following other guidelines, and so your QC testing need to be in line with the guidelines that the laboratory is using. So that's why we cannot say like you need to do it so many times in the month or so many times per week or whatever. The only thing that we can advise is if you have a new lot number coming in, you can do a QC, of course. But I mean, it's all depending on the guidelines that the laboratory is using. And then maybe we can switch to the questions that are coming up in the chat.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So the first question is, how long does it take before the ETEST is on room temperature? That depends. If you look at the old packs where you had a foam 100 or a blister 100 pack, in fact, you need to take out the entire pack and you need to let it come onto room temperature, so that can take a while. If you are looking at, so let's say for that setting, it would be 15 minutes. If you are looking at a single pack, you have only one strip, so that can be up to 5 minutes. So it depends. I mean, the old packs are all phased or almost all phased out to the new packagings. And if you have one strip that you need to let go, that needs to come to room temperature, that will take approximately 5 minutes. If you really want to be sure, keep it on the bench for 15 minutes, and then you're good to go. So what happens if you accidentally put two strips together? I think there it's meant that you have a pack with several strips that do stick together, and then you put them on the agar. Normally there won't be any diffusion from the second strip to the first one. If you don't see it, if you see it, please take it off. So that's making more sense than putting two strips together. But if you are not seeing this, I don't think that there will be a big impact on your result. Of course, I mean, ideally, I won't do it. So please check and take off the extra strip if possible. And then there's a question on in the summary mentioned an MIC can be used for categorization. Can you explain this further? So as you know, and all our countries are using, I mean, in Europe, most of the countries are using UCAST. So UCAST is publishing breakpoint tables, and with your MIC that you get from the ETEST results, you can go to that breakpoint table and you can see where does it fall. Does it fall into the sensitive category, to the intermediate category, which is now redefined, but I will not go into detail, or into the resistant category. And so with your MIC results, you can know if your strain is sensitive, intermediate, or resistant to the antibiotic. So in fact, you make the link with the MIC and the categorization with the UCAST breakpoint tables. Then there is again a question on linezolid. So the 80% inhibition, for example, for linezolid, I think we already went over that in the pre-questions. So I don't think we have an example of a picture of linezolid, but I have it in my computer somewhere, but it will take me too much time to find it back now. So maybe we can send it afterwards to have a more visual example.
Yeah, I think what also would be good is once we send out resources after this webinar, we could maybe summarize some of the answers to questions as well. And if, like I say, if we don't get around to everything, or if you have questions that come to mind after the webinar, you're also welcome to submit those and we can answer those too.
Yep. Then for another question is on anaerobic bacteria, on the FAA agar, knowing that bioMérieux is not commercializing an FAA agar, but that's what UCAST is recommending. We validated with another medium for anaerobics, anaerobic bacteria. So it is also okay to use the recommended bioMérieux plate, because all our ETEST have been validated for, I mean, at least for anaerobes for that plate. So then another question, are they likely to be viable if left out at room temperature in error? I guess the strips. It depends. I mean, if you leave them for 2 days, no, that's not a good idea, because I mean, depending on the antibiotic, you have antibiotics, for example, the carbapenems that are really unstable. So definitely you will have degradation of your antibiotic. If you leave them on the table for, I mean, a couple of hours, that should be fine. I mean, if you have a doubt, and if you left out 100 ETEST strips, I would suggest doing a QC to check if it's still okay, and then it's okay to use them. Again, preferentially, don't leave them too long out of the freezer or fridge. Depends on where you store them. Why are antifungal inoculation doubt carried twice? That's to be sure to have enough growth, because first of all, yeasts are growing slower, so you need to start from a somewhat denser inoculum. And if you do that twice, so you will have an initially higher density of your strain, and that will ensure that you have an easy way of reading the ETEST in the end. Yeah. And then an addition on the left to the room temperature, so assuming not to, of course. So that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good question. When you read MIC on, let's say, 0.094, do you report as 0.125? Yes, you can. I mean, or yes, that, I mean, we have these in-between values, but if you really want to make really send the result for validation, you can use the upper limit, so the real MIC, I would say, which is always this 2 times dilution. Do you have to perform both? So the resistant mechanism strips, so CT/CTL, so with and without clavulanic acid. In fact, if you really want to know if it is an ESBL, you need to use the 3 variations that we have. So with only one, you will never have all the answers, because then you can easily confuse with an MC, for example. So you need to use the 3 resistant detection strips to know if it's an ESBL or not, and to be sure that it's not another resistant mechanism. And then on a 9 centimeter or 90 millimeter agar, are there exceptions when you cannot put 2 ETESTs on it? For example, the ARD ETEST and an antibiotic ETEST. That's a good question. If you are just using 2 normal antibiotics, I would say, always put them anti-parallel, because otherwise your ellipses are in the same place, and then when you do it anti-parallel, that works better. I don't know by heart if there's a limitation on putting an ARD strip next to a normal one. We can check, but I don't think so, that there's a limitation. So it's 2 strips, but if there is a limitation if you put an ARD strip next to a normal one, so we need to double check. I'm guessing not, so I don't see why. But Saj, if you have other info on that, you can.
Yeah, and we've also had a few other questions pop up. One was regarding the landing page. So just to add, with the resources that we send out, we'll send a link to the landing page as well. Another question that we've had is on the stacking. So why can you stack the plates a maximum of 5 high? And that's essentially more than 5. There's a risk that air circulation between the plates is not good enough, and it can impact the growth of bacteria. So everything in the IFUs, that's information that's in the IFUs. So anything that's in there is how it's been validated. So that is what we would recommend. I would also like to, if it's okay, Jürgen, just touch on the resource center, because we've had a lot of questions about where to find information and how to locate it. So I've just logged into the resource center, and if it's okay, I'll quickly share my screen.
There's 2 additional questions that I maybe can quickly
oh yeah, answer. Go for it. There's a lot of questions popping up, so I'm sorry if we do not get around to it. We will cover it later.
We try to answer them all. So can you read the ETEST for anaerobic bacteria after 24, 48 and 72 hours? I don't know that by heart, but there is on the resource center a list of how to read and how to inoculate each drug-bug combination. So you can probably find the answer there. And I don't know, Saj, if you will come up to that list or not when you show the resource center. But there you have an easy overview on how to use and for which drug-bug combination you need to do what. And is it okay to repeatedly freeze thaw the packs with multiple strips? Yes, it has been validated, so you can freeze thaw. For example, if you have a 100 pack, it's even validated up to 400 times. So there is no issue of doing that repeatedly. So it's validated to do that. And then I'll let the floor to you again.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Apologies, I tried to zoom in when I was sharing it last time into the hazy endpoint and it wasn't letting me. So hopefully it will be fine when we share the resource center. Okay, so with the resource center, when you log in, you're able to search using the reference number of the ETEST you're looking at, or you can type in the name. I've just typed in S30 as the packaging type, so we've got a list of different references that have popped up here. One thing to note is that if you're not using your reference number, you'll see over here that there's US and WW is worldwide. So everybody who's on this webinar is based in Europe, so definitely be using the WW version. So if we click on that and have a quick look at what's available, so you've got the QC certificate, pack insert, supplementary inserts and statement. You want to click on the pack insert to find the instructions for use, and that's where you'll find the single IFU. So if we click on that and do a quick preview, just to run through, so anybody who's not had a chance to view a single IFU yet to see what information is available, we'll scroll to the top of it. So we've got amikacin here, we've got intended use, indications for use. So you've got which microorganisms are relevant to that particular ETEST. Principle, that's summing up a little bit of the information that we went through about the composition of the ETEST, what the content of the kit is, materials required but not provided, recommended culture media, warnings, precautions, storage and stability. And with these single IFUs, you have information for the different packaging types. So of course, looking at the packaging type that's relevant to you. Handling, we've got some lovely images in there. I'll scroll past, I don't want to bore anyone. The instructions for use, a bit on the composition. So table 1, this is the table that we highlighted earlier in the presentation. And this is where you can find information on the organism group, the recommended agar, inoculum information, and incubation guidance as well. So everything will be in here. Results and interpretation. And I guess really, I mean, we could even have a quick nose at these examples. So we've got the sharp endpoints here. So I'll zoom in a little bit further. Sharp endpoints, so 2, again, MIC of 2. Over here, this is an interesting one, because if we zoom in a little bit further, really you've got it between two points, so between 2 and 3. So you'd read the upper value, so 3 in this case. And in this case, it would be greater than or equal to the highest value on the strip. So just a few extra examples for us to go through. Interpretation information and some QC information. And again, I won't bore you with that, but it's just to give everybody an idea of what's included in the single IFU. And I'll stop sharing. So I think with that, any questions that may come up after this session, and we'll round up now, please do email them across. I hope that this has been a useful and informative webinar session for everybody. Do let us know, in feedback, if there's anything more you'd like to see, any content that you'd like us to share, any further information. But thank you so much for attending. Jürgen, thank you so much for fielding so many of the questions as well. And hopefully we will catch up with everybody soon, either on visits or on webinars. Perfect. So have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.